So there's an anger and aggression system. It's complicated. There's probably two of them. One is defensive aggression. That's probably more associated with neuroticism, technically. The other is probably predatory aggression. And, you know, human beings are definitely predators. We're meat eaters, and, you know, our closest relatives, chimpanzees, for example, they're pretty good hunters. They'll gather together in packs and bring down 30-pound colobus monkeys, and the meat is very popular among the chimps. And so predatory aggression seems to be a separate circuit, and as we'll discuss further along, I think the predatory aggression circuit and the maternal solicitude circuit, because there's also a care circuit, have evolved to be at opposite ends of the same distribution. I think that's the agreeableness distribution in the big five. So on one end there's maternal solicitude, and the other end there's predatory aggression. And you can imagine how those things have to inhibit one another. Because, well, with many mammals, bears for example, the males are so predatory that you have to keep them away from the cubs because they'll kill them. Human beings, I mean, there's some aggression towards children, especially if the children aren't biological relatives, but men are pretty caring for male mammals, and women are actually quite predatory for male mammals. So thermoregulation, your hypothalamus takes care of whether you're hot or cold. Panic and escape, those are circuits that also seem to be associated with pain fundamentally, although threat can maybe trigger them as well. And the panic escape system doesn't exactly seem to be the same system as the anxiety and fear system, even though they sound roughly equivalent, right? You might think of panic as just the extreme level of fear, and I think fear can trigger panic, but panic seems to be a more primordial circuit, and if you're panicking, there's an immense impetus to escape. So that's a different circuit. Affiliation and care we covered, sexual desire. Exploration and play, both of those seem to be separate circuits. So Jack Panksepp actually, who wrote a great book called Affective Neuroscience, by the way, if any of you are interested in like the psychobiology of behavior and motivation, Jack Panksepp's book is one of the best. I don't have a paper by him in our collection, but he's a very smart guy. He wrote this book called Affective Neuroscience, and it's actually, given its title and the relative complexity of its thoughts, it's actually quite readable, even though it's a text. It's a little more personal than your typical text might be. And Panksepp is also very interested in psychodynamic and personality ideas, so he's a very broad thinker. And so if you're interested in an approach to psychology that sort of crosses the threshold from personality into emotion and biology, Panksepp, as well as Gray, there's a Gray paper that you're reading, Panksepp's a very, very good source. He discovered the play circuit, for example, and he also discovered that rats laugh. So if you tickle a rat, it laughs. You can't hear it though, because it laughs ultrasonically like a bat. But if you record the rat giggling and then slow down the tape, then you can tell that the rat laughs. And rats need to play, and most mammals need to play in order to socialize them. So one of the things, you can think about this when you're parents too, and this is probably especially relevant for the men, because one of the things you might ask is, what role do men play in the socialization of children? And one thing that men really do seem to do with kids is to engage in rough and tumble play, especially once they're a little older than 2, say 2 to 5 or something, and kids love that. They absolutely love rough and tumble play. It gets them so excited that, you know, they get out of control fundamentally. But rough and tumble play is an excellent mode of socialization because it teaches the child the distinction between aggression and too much aggression, right? Because if you're wrestling with a kid, the kid has to keep their behavioral output under a fair degree of control to keep the game going, to make it rough enough to be exciting, but not so rough that they get hurt, or, you know, that they stick their thumb in their dad's eye or something like that. And you can think of that from a Piagetian sense too, because it's a game. But imagine that if you're trying to figure out how to configure yourself around other people, if you haven't had that rough and tumble play, you don't really know where the boundaries of your body are, you know, and you don't know how much you can take and how much you can be stretched and how much you can be thrown around, and when something actually hurts rather than is frightening. And so all of that intense sort of play that boys in particular are likely to engage in, although girls also like it, seems to be very useful for teaching children about how to engage with the world and with other people in a physical way, and that's one of the physiological foundations for higher order socialization. So it's very useful. I mean, I've often noted that children who haven't had the opportunity to engage in physical play, they're kind of awkward. You know, they're not seated well in their body, and it's like they're kind of vague physically, whereas the ones who've been twisted around and bent and thrown up in the air and, you know, wrestled in general, they're a lot more conscious of their limits and their abilities in their body, and they're also much more able to invite other kids to play. You can think about this with regards to dogs. You know, if you have a dog, you know the dog, you can tell when the dog wants to play, right? What does the dog do? Yeah, it jumps around and it puts its rear end in the air often and its head down and it looks up, which is a little bit submissive and a little bit friendly, and it wags its tail and it might bark and it moves back and forth. And like little kids that want to play do, well, they don't put their tails in the air obviously, but they engage in like play invitation behaviors like that, you know, a little bit of teasing sometimes, and they're trying to get some play initiated. It's also practice for later dominance. When chimps play, the males in particular, as they approach adolescence, the play behavior, because they'll throw sticks at the old chimps who are laying down and sleeping, or come up and poke them, or, you know, tease them. And then as they become more and more powerful and more adolescent, say, into adulthood, then that play will become full-blown dominance challenges, as you don't no doubt noticed if you were in junior high school, because that's exactly what happens to teachers, right? The little elementary school kids, they're kind of cute. When they misbehave, they're sort of playful, but by the time grade 8 or grade 9 comes around, the pushing on the teacher is a lot harder. And so you can see how play shades into dominance dispute. But it is a separate circuit.